Hello, and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality. This podcast is part of GreenDeal-NET, a Jean Monnet network that brings together research and teaching on EU climate and sustainability governance. I'm your host, Jan Eggens, a researcher at Stockholm University, where I work on the EU climatic project. Some housekeeping before we start this episode. As you might have noticed, our episodes are now also available in video format. You can watch either directly on Spotify or you can go to the GreenDeal-NET YouTube channel. So be sure to check it out, and then you can see our lovely faces when we discuss these interesting topics. So this episode is part of a series on the external dimension of EU climate policy. We already had an episode on global leadership and one on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. If you have missed those, make sure to check it out. And of course, subscribe to stay up to date on the future episodes of this series. So for today, we are going to look a little bit deeper into hydrogen partnerships. As we discussed in episode 8 on hydrogen, the EU and countries in the global north are investing in clean hydrogen as part of their strategy to meet their climate targets. It has a key role to play in decarbonizing the energy-intensive industry sector and the transport sector. But countries are not only looking at producing hydrogen domestically, but also at importing hydrogen to meet these demands. And the hydrogen mostly comes from countries in the global south. These hydrogens have received some criticism because they risk creating unequal partnerships, and critics argue that these are mainly aimed at serving European needs or needs in the global north and kind of going against energy needs in the countries themselves. So in that way, they might be a form of green colonialism. To kind of help us understand what these partnerships are and also to get a better idea of what this green colonialism is, we are joined today by our very own How Green Is Your Deal hydrogen expert and recurring guest Marie Dejonghe, a researcher at Ghent University. Hi Marie, it's great to have you back.
Hi, Jan. It's very nice to be called your in-house hydrogen expert. I didn't know I had this role, but it's nice to hear so.
Yeah, well, you are our hydrogen expert, and we are so excited to have you here. So maybe our first question to kind of recap a little bit, what actually is this clean hydrogen and why our countries, in particular in the global north, are looking to import it from abroad?
So very importantly is to say is that hydrogen is an energy carrier. So clean hydrogen carries energy just like batteries do or electricity. And it's used to decarbonize large industries. Very important is that hydrogen, when it's powered, it does not emit any CO2, so it can really help for countries and their push towards global decarbonization. It can be used in very different ways. I already said industrial decarbonization, but you can also use it for powering cars or heating homes, but the application where it's mostly looked at is hard to invade industrial sectors, let's say chemical sectors such as producing ammonia, which we use to produce fertilizer, or methanol, which is a chemical product we often use, or even to produce green forms of steel, an industry that is still very polluting. So in a nutshell, it's used for industries that are hard to abate and where electricity is no solution. Where comes the clean hydrogen then from? Because hydrogen does not produce any CO2 itself, but CO2 can be produced in producing the hydrogen, in making the hydrogen. And the clean version, the most clean version, is actually a process where water, so H2O, is split into H2 or hydrogen and oxygen. And this is done with an electrolyzer, which is a chemical process. And if this electrolyzer is powered with renewable electricity, then there is virtually no CO2 emitted in this process. And this is actually the green hydrogen where countries and policymakers talk about. Other types of hydrogen production are also possible. You can also power your electrolyzer with nuclear energy or with energy from biomass, which is also more clean versions, but also a very CO2 intensive production process is with the heating natural gas, and there is obviously CO2 emitted. Also, you can capture it, the CO2, which is a form called blue hydrogen, but we don't know how many CO2 we can actually capture. And the hydrogen we are producing today, which is almost 100 million tons a year globally, is produced with very polluting ways. So these production methods, so the clean or renewable electricity, makes actually that hydrogen will be imported. Why? In Europe, we are just very geographically bad located. We already did not have any fossil fuels or very limited fossil fuels in our stores, but also in terms of renewable electricity, we are limited. Also, on top of that, we have a very big exercise in decarbonizing, where electricity will play a big part. And if we have to decarbonize our whole energy mix and electrify it, and on top of that, also produce the hydrogen needed for our industry and for industrial decarbonization, there is actually a concern this will just not be possible, and also not cost efficient, because there are countries where it's just more cheap to produce renewables, because they just have more access and abundant solar and wind shining and blowing. So therefore, they're looking to import from more sun and wind-rich countries to meet their climate imperatives, and also on the same time decarbonize their energy mixes. So this is a bit in a nutshell why hydrogen will be imported. And if you then look at those countries that are more sun and wind rich, you eventually come to countries that are located in the global south. So sub-Saharan, but also northern African countries actually are very well positioned. Also countries in the Middle East, I often say that they have won the lottery twice, because they also have fossil fuels, but they are the ones that are emerging as potential hydrogen suppliers to the global north.
Thanks a lot for this recap. I think it's so important, and indeed that if we do use hydrogen as kind of this alternative fuel to decarbonize, it of course is also produced in a way that is not emitting like a lot of CO2 either, because then what's really the point, I guess, or you want to make sure that everything, the whole process is as possible. And also thank you for showing some lights on also how both the geographical location of the EU, but also its own energy demands, make it necessary to then import hydrogen from countries that might have more capacity for renewable energy. So before we go into a little bit deeper into this relationship between then these countries in the global north and the countries in the global south, as I mentioned, now there's a lot of talk about green colonialism, also when it comes to the EU energy transition. Can you just say a brief words about what green colonial actually just is in general?
This is an interesting question, because in the academic literature, but also amongst policymakers, activists, there is no clear or one definition on what green colonialism is. It's often also used with other concepts like carbon imperialism or green extractivism. It's also something you often hear, climate colonialism. But what all these concepts actually are similar in, and how they are alike, is that they have a critique on existing power structures and power relations between a wealthy global north and a less developed or emerging global south. And that this will be exacerbated or reproduced within the green transition. And this is not only the case for hydrogen, which we're talking about today, but they often also use these projects for these concepts to talk about critical raw materials, for example, which also have a whole energy transition dimension. So it's very important to see this in a more structural dependency dimension and relation between the global north and the global south. And the green adjective that they add is to actually show that in this green transition, in this energy transition, in the climate transition, that these existing power structures or injustices, inequalities will actually be reproduced.
So a bit like always in academia, concepts are not so clear, and there's lots of different concepts to discuss one thing. But what I get from what you're saying is that a lot of the time it's also more of like an analytical tool or a word we can use to look at certain power structures that then are there, like you mentioned, or to examine relationships from like a more critical perspective, and also think a little bit about how all our activities of the green transition and decarbonization might impact other countries as well. I think you also mentioned critical raw materials, which I feel has gotten a lot of attention when it comes to mining, etc., and how we do it, even in Europe itself. So then when we use this lens of green colonialism and we look at these hydrogen agreements or hydrogen partnerships between the global north and the global south, do we see some evidence then there of these unequal power relationships, or how can we use it to understand what is happening there?
Well, just a big disclaimer also for the listeners here, there is no hydrogen trade yet. So all these projects are still emerging. They're very much in an early phase. Very limited projects are actually being developed. So this is a good and a bad thing. Firstly, for those projects is that we see that how they are now being developed and being announced, that, for example, the local populations are not really included in the development of these projects. So we call those more procedural injustices, where the local communities have little say in how the projects will look like. Also, a lot of private companies, as I said, because of the industrial interests that are in this development of these hydrogen projects, a lot of private companies are going to these countries and developing these projects. And if lucky, they do talk with the national elites, but there's also some contention toward those national elites in these countries. So we see that, for example, local population have very little to say in this project, and this could actually reproduce the inequalities that are already there, and that things are just being decided above their heads. Another thing that we see in developing hydrogen projects is that a lot of the know-how, a lot of the technology patterns, infrastructure is all developed in the global north. So if we would say, okay, let's develop these projects in the global south, it risks to not include technology from there, because there's just no transfer of any know-how, any technology, which actually risks to build like these more enclave economies where you just have like close to a port because you have to export it from further away, and just have limited opportunities for local industries to grow. Another thing that you can see in developing these projects is that most of these projects are focusing specifically on hydrogen exports. And this creates often an even trade balance, because if you export hydrogen, hydrogen exports are very difficult in terms of technicalities, so it will mostly be exported in the form of a derivative, so a hydrogen-based product, to make the exportation easier. But even then, there is very low added value to these products, and these products are actually very cheap compared to the actually finished products that are more down the value chain. So there you create a relationship where countries in the global south will export hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives, which are fairly cheap compared to the finished product they will actually have to import in the end if they want to keep this industry going. This is actually very similar as we have now, for example, with cacao. These countries, they export cacao beans, but they have to import chocolate, and the value is added not with the cacao beans, but it's added at the chocolate. So there you have an uneven trade relationship between these countries, and there's actually a fear that this for hydrogen would be very similar in terms of future hydrogen trades. Another point which I think is very important and is also becoming more and more to the front in terms of also budgetary austerity measures and everything, is that these projects require a lot of money. There is a lot of innovation involved in these projects. A lot of these large-scale hydrogen projects, we don't have that yet. So there's so much learning to do, and this leaves a lot of money. Countries in the global south, often already with limitations in terms of budgets because of colonial relations in the past already. They also struggle and they want to attract investors, but to make sure that investors will come to their countries, they have to do a lot of measures to, they call it de-risk the investment, so to make sure that there will be less risks in their investments. For example, with tax exemptions or giving land to these companies, which actually will give them, firstly, more debts in the end, and makes them actually financing a transition, which is actually then for the global north and not for themselves. So there's also this more financial dimension that is risky the local development of these countries. And then also other very common issues, like, for example, lands. Here in Europe, we have a lot of struggles with local communities and the not in my backyard movement, and they don't want wind turbines and they don't want solar panels on their fields. But this is so different in countries in the global south. It's not like there's just deserts where there are no people living and we can just put our solar panels there and export the hydrogen. So this also comes with conflicts where land is privatized of these local communities. Also, water can be an issue. As I said in the beginning, if you want to produce it in a green way, you have to split water. There's a lot of water needed then. And it's very it's very striking to see that countries that are often rich in sun and wind are also water constraints, for example. And if you then would just use the water that is already a scarce resource for then the production of hydrogen to then just make sure that the global north can make their green transition, it also just gives an idea of that it's just not fair, and there are a lot of issues. And so these are more very specific issues to this project, but there's also this more common idea if we have to keep on using that much energy, and if we have to keep all these industries here, and if in how we are consuming, if this growth in terms of planetary boundaries is still the way forward. And these are things that are less easy to solve, of course, but this is because it's more an ideology and more an idea that is shaping the way we are behaving and structuring our economies. So a lot of risks, actually, and a lot of red flags, I would say, in how these projects may evolve and how they are being developed.
When you were talking about this hydrogen and how it's being exported and then maybe needs to be imported if people want to use it, I was also immediately thinking about this chocolate example, because that's also so clear. I mean, it also shows how the difference between maybe like the product to make something and then what is actually valuable in the end, and how important it is to also have the end product in places. So thanks a lot for that analogy. I really like it. For me, when you were talking, it seems like a lot of the risks or the problems with these potential trade agreements is this idea that might still exist that somehow in the global north, it's still like in the global south, it's still like a blank space, or this idea of like empty spaces where, of course, there are people living there. They have their own needs, they have their own energy needs, they have their own water needs. There are inequalities happening there. So if you're not careful, you just risk really negatively impacting society there. I think now being in Sweden, this is something that is also being discussed a lot, because so much of the renewable energy needs, the government is saying like, let's just put it in the north. Like there's no one living in the north, but of course you have the indigenous people, the Sami, living there in the north, and having these big renewable energy projects there really hinders their way of life. So I think this also kind of shows how when we talk about green colonialism and all of this, it's often then for countries in the global south, but we might have similar practices still going on here. And a lot of it then has to do with this idea of, empty space that is not empty. I mean, people are living there and they should have a say as well. So thanks a lot. So many thoughts or so many ideas happening there. So then the good thing, as you said, is that these partnerships are still being developed. There are not that many that are actually in place already. So what can we then actually do as countries in the global north to make sure that, hey, the way we are doing these projects, we are not just repeating the mistakes of the past, but we are actually creating more equity? Are there any strategies countries can use to do so?
Well, it's a hard question, of course, because all those projects, I'm now talking here as if the Global South is just one big bulk of countries, and they all have their own cultures and their own decision making and their own histories, path dependencies, but also ideas of, and their energy mixes are very different. So it's very hard to have these tailor-made solutions. I also did not go to any of these countries and visit them. So it's merely here a theoretical exercise that I did, and as academics often do, into theorizing these solutions. But I think one of the very important things is just participation. Just also give agency on these countries through multilateral organizations. They're already, for example, the ECOWAS countries are already working together and also publishing hydrogen strategies to also just have more bargaining power. And I think here is very much key to also make sure that these countries are at the table, have a seat at the table, and also can just say like, okay, but these are the red lines or these are the conditions on how these projects are being developed. Other opportunities could be is to also have these shared ownership projects. I know, for example, in Norway, where families are just co-owning the solar panels, and if they have abundant energy, they can sell it, and so you also give some make sure that some revenues flow back to these countries, and it's not only to just produce energy for another set of countries, but also to make sure that they can also reap the benefits of these investments themselves. And then another thing, which is also more and more being pushed by more multilateral organizations, like, for example, also from the UN, but also IRENA, is actually green industrialization and green industrial development, and this can go in very different ways. They have these very nice theoretical terms from forward linkages and backward linkages of a country to really link the industrial things that are going on, or the hydrogen projects, to other industrial sectors. And for example, for hydrogen, you can say like, okay, maybe countries that are also rich in other critical materials that are necessary, for example, to build electrolyzers, can not only produce hydrogen, but they can establish a manufacturing of electrolyzers. And countries are already pushing for this. They are, for example, implementing local content requirements and say, okay, if you are then setting up these projects here, then you better also set up an electrolyzer manufacturing company here, so we can also add value by producing these electrolyzers. This is something that when you go more upstream than the value chain, But where actually the value is added is down the value chain, as I said, with the cacao and the chocolate. So it's countries, for example, Mauritania, they're very rich in iron ore, which is a very crucial material for producing steel. Why would Mauritania export hydrogen if they can, for example, produce green steel in their countries and export it to European countries? It's not even that far compared to, for example, Namibia. So all these countries are often very rich in critical raw materials, so they can actually leverage and develop a downstream industry, which generates the wealth, also creates jobs, creates knowledge, has spillovers to a lot of other societal issues that can actually solve a lot of the struggle these countries are struggling with. And this is also something that is being discussed, for example, in more academic rooms, is that this is called actually a renewables pull effect, and that is actually the renewables that are abundant in these countries, they pull the industries to their countries and actually then create wealth. It's something that for almost all industrial sectors is actually more beneficial because they're very energy intensive. They already were suffering a lot with COVID. We're already suffering a lot with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis that followed. So high energy prices are here in Europe, and there is also a risk that the countries in the global south will be just providing much cheaper electricity than we can just because of our geographic location. So this renewables pull effect is actually a theoretical concept to showcase that this is possible in terms of economy. I have to make a disclaimer here, is that it's just for now very anecdotal and it's still no reality, but it's something that can actually take place. So a lot of opportunities actually to build up these industrial capacities, also to maybe leapfrog, because some of these countries don't have a very substantial industrial capacity that is sometimes still based on fossil fuels. But if you would then use hydrogen, you can really leapfrog the whole industry that is based on fossil fuels and establish immediately green capacities. On the other hand, and I think this is actually which will make or break this transition, is the fundamental reason why Europe wants to import hydrogen is to maintain competitiveness and industrial competitiveness in a global landscape we are witnessing today with Trump and tariffs all over the place, is that they're more and more inward looking. They're publishing industrial policies where they say, okay, we want to subsidize sectors, industrial sectors. So from a more political security industrial policy dimension, Europe or other countries in the global north do not want these countries in the global south to attract all their industries. So there is this tension. So it's not only about giving agency to these countries, but also this relation between the global north and the structures that are taking place in the end. So from a justice perspective, you would say, okay, go for it, establish these green industries, but actually that's not what Europe wants. Europe wants to keep their industries, so that's why they're wanting to import the hydrogen. And I'm putting it a bit simplistic here, but it's just to show how this hydrogen trade is actually just evolving in maybe the same power structures, and maybe that's green colonialist after all, question mark.
It is, of course, if you look at it, I guess, from more like a realist perspective or really like a power perspective, you can always ask yourself the question, why should the EU help other countries in this way? I mean, this renewable pool, it sounds like such an amazing idea and such an idealistic idea as well, but something that can be so positive for a lot of countries, or it can be so beneficial. But then, yeah, like you said, what are actually the EU's interests at this point? Does it actually want to provide assistance in this way? Or is it easier to kind of set up these partnerships and say, yeah, we will do a little bit for local needs, but in reality, still kind of I don't want to say hoarding, it sounds like such a negative word, but hoarding the industry and the knowledge and then the money as well to themselves. Interesting, especially in these times where it seems indeed that where before sometimes I had this idea that cooperation is still part of one of the values, or at least when we talk about climate action in general, it seems like there was some focus on cooperation and helping each other out. But now, yeah, like you said, more focus on competitiveness and serving your own needs. Let's see what happens there. I do think it would be good, like as you also mentioned, for countries in the EU and for the EU as itself to just at least, talk with countries and see what their needs are and trying to include people as a first step. But then hopefully in time we can get to a better world for all of us. Related to this, for my final question, as you know, I always like to ask, what gives you hope for the future? I think before you mentioned climate youth. Does this still give you hope? Is there something else that gives you hope in these particularly dark times?
Yeah, it's a hard question on what gives you hope. But generally, I think I'm a very optimistic person, and I want to stay optimistic, because I don't think if you're very negative, or they call themselves often realists, if you then can achieve a lot. I mean, I think some idealism would actually suit everyone. For hydrogen specifically, I think it's a good thing that we're having these conversations, and also I think it's becoming more and more prominent under discussions that we just cannot go like we did. It's not even 100 years ago. About just grabbing the resources, building our industries, and I think this is way more present in conversations, that we just cannot repeat our mistakes from the past. So this gives me hope that there's at least some more consciousness about these things. Although I think that this consciousness not goes as far as it should go. I think there's this whole more zooming out and seeing it from a power perspective, and see how structural dependencies are still taking place. It's not on the table right now. But I think we have to stay hopeful. And I think what we have to do is trying to keep the conversation going and bring this to the table, especially as social science researchers in a topic, climate, but also energy, which is very technical, which is mostly steered by engineers. And it's not only about social acceptance, it's about seeing like what are the social structures, how are we. So I think we should keep on bringing these messages, and I think it's important that the EU also keeps on funding these projects where social sciences are included. I know it's mostly to get the project approved, but maybe we can also push a bit more and really showcase how important this interdisciplinary research is, also for very local populations.
I feel like I'm more of like an optimist myself, or like I try to be as well. There's like this whole, I don't know, discourse about hope, and how if you still have hope that you can change things, then you can also have like a call to action, because you can make a better world. And by having these conversations and by having funding for doing more critical research into, the governance of all of this renewable energy and this energy transition, and how we are doing things, we can perhaps steer policies in a certain way, or have some kind of impact and make some kind of contribution. I think that's really important. So thanks a lot. Thanks again for sharing all of your great hydrogen insights with us. You know now that you're our hydrogen expert, so I might reach out to you again in the future when some of these agreements are a bit more materialized. We'll definitely stay in touch. So really, thanks a lot. That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendeal-net.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.